Today's webinar on reinforcing good design principles on small to medium scale developments with Darren Beer from Focus on Design as your speaker. My name is Dawn de Vries. I'm chair of the RTPI South West, and I'll be hosting this afternoon's event and coordinating the Q&A at the end of the presentation. In respect of housekeeping and to help you get the most out of this session, I'm just going to cover a couple of quick points. So as delegates, you've all been muted. If you have any questions, then please raise these via the question box in the GoToWebinar panel, which may be on the right or top of your screen. The speaker's presentation will run for approximately about 20 minutes before we come to the Q&A. We will get to as many questions as we are able, but any not answered will be considered after the session and responses will be emailed to all applicants. A copy of the presentation will be included as a handout for you to download from the GoToWebinar panel towards the end of the session. And if you personally lose connection during the session, please try to rejoin by the link emailed to you from GoToWebinar. You can increase your Wi-Fi connectivity by disconnecting all other devices from Wi-Fi. If the speaker loses connectivity, then please wait in the webinar, but keep an eye on your emails in case we have to relaunch the session with a new link. So now the formalities are done, I would like to introduce you to Darren Beer, who will be presenting for this event.
Many thanks, Dawn. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our presentation on reinforcing good design principles on small to medium scale developments. My name is Darren Beer. I'm from a company called Focus on Design. We're based in the South West, just outside of Bristol. So today I'm going to be talking to you about, why good design is important in small to medium scale developments, the role of the designer, a small element on climate emergency, embracing the change, particularly with regard to the current climate, how to identify site characteristics, context analysis and concepts, give some feedback on what makes a difference in terms of placemaking, shaping character and design. And I'll be providing some development samples for you to have a look, and I'll narrate those as we go through. And at the end of the presentation, there's some small slides on appearance. So why is good design important, and what makes for a good design? As a designer, and for many years, and everyone will be aware of this, good design is very subjective. Everyone has a personal and individual opinion on design. For us as designers, in our practice, the art of design, good design, is to remove your personal preference or your opinion and design for the place that you're actually designing for, and designing for the place that integrates naturally and complements its surroundings, helps to deliver sustainable communities, design that considers environmental impacts and sustainability credentials, design that considers the climate change emergency and all the impacts that would have when influencing a design of a scheme of whatever size, in fact, not just small and medium developments. Designing something that leaves a positive legacy is very important and would stand the test of time. Schemes that really do stand out, really do make a positive contribution to the kind of context that they fit within. Designing for a place that is about using colours, shapes, textures and spaces, placemaking spaces, forms and content in a harmonious and balanced way, and provides an identity and quality. And generally, good design will also add value. So for developers considering developing sites, materials, workmanship and general appearance, certainly adds value to the scheme in our experience. In terms of the role of the designer, I've categorised these into three key areas really. Now, one is getting a good brief, having a sound understanding from your client on what's to be achieved for the development, the aims of the development, so the aspirations from the client, and given the local context. Research is everything into a brief. So a time spent at the beginning researching your subject, your area, the site in question and its context is extremely important. What goes along with that is information gathering. So gathering up as much information as you possibly can. I'm a firm believer in more information is better than little or none, because it really does help to shape your own brief in your own mind. There's very much legal matters and policy context that comes into it. So, we would very much sort of liaise with planners on policy context in conjunction with our design brief. Legal matters do take quite precedent when looking at schemes. So, things like rights of access, public rights of way, etc., and just general constraints on the development. So that kind of bubble of information is very important to understand before any design work takes place. Of course, there are local and national aspirations that are ever changing, month on month, year on year. So there might be design guidance, the national design guidance, of course, and every local authority in our experience has their own policies on spatial standards, for example, and building homes of the future. So there might be some adaptations for development as you go through. In terms of the process, we find that in terms of the process of design, it's very much a collaborative process. So with any scheme, we are formulating as a team of people, or part of a team of people, and act as the hub of that design team. It's very important to understand the inputs of others, in our experience, just to help shape your understanding of the site before pen is put to paper. We then move on to assessment. So again, it's making sure that a site visit is taking place always. It's easy these days to actually go onto Google Earth, look at a site with Street View as well. It's very easy to look at context, which is, there's nothing wrong with that, but there's nothing better than actually walking the site and understanding its physical and local context. Once the first three things are under the process are undertaken, then it's the kind of evaluation. So it's mapping out really for yourself and working yourself a brief to before pen is put to paper again, and understanding all the constraints, etc., that you're and everything that's going to, and the influences that are going to shape your design. We then move on to concept. So it's taking all the ingredients of everything that's been input to that point, and then discuss that with all members of the team before working up the detailed design, which again is an up and down collaboration with colleagues, clients, and fellow consultants and experts who form part of that design team. The approach I always take to design personally is to be open-minded, certainly listen to others and accept influences, good or bad. Never be too hung up on criticism, because any comments or criticism are, you can turn into positives in my experience. As I said earlier on in the presentation, design is very, very subjective. So everyone will have an opinion on how things should look, feel, and are designed. So it is very much a balancing act in that respect. Taking a methodical, logical, and simple approach is always recommended. Quite often the most simple solutions are the better ones and can make for a better result. Consideration of all the elements, really. So it's going back to that wider team influence, and you're drawing that back to your analysis and drawing some conclusions and that, discussing, sharing with the team, and then before you go forward again. And as I say, keep it simple. So the role generally is to act as the conductor of the overall design, be the hub of that design development, and liaise with colleagues as you go through to hopefully then build your successful design. I'll spend just a couple of minutes on climate change emergency. Obviously, with the way the world at the moment and the current climate change emergency strategy and policies across up and down the country, split these into kind of 6 key areas really. One is sustainability, design and placemaking, sustainable transport, landscape and ecology, mitigating flood risk, and construction techniques and construction. Now, these are a series of really kind of broad headings that we kind of consider as part of designing up a scheme. a lot of these subjects are influenced clearly by wider team members, so it goes back to that very much collaborative approach to how schemes are approached and designed. I've put quite a few kind of tips in there for the types of things that we would consider, in particular on design and placemaking. Orientation of buildings is very important to maximise solar gain. Providing balanced and mixed communities. Connectivity of the scheme is very, very important to understand how the scheme connects to its wider environs. Oh, apologies. Creating accessible homes for diversity and longevity. I think when we build homes now, then they should last longer and they should plan for adaptation in the future. And hopefully some of the planning reforms under the white paper will assist that in the future. Homes for working has become important, very important over the last few months, as we all know. And I personally, I think it will be continue in that vein. So I think what's happened in the last few months will change the way people do work generally. And there's no problem in kind of putting that into your designs going forward. And then creation of unique characters and character areas, design spaces and spaces for people is extremely important to the design process. Going on to looking at sites itself. Now, where we always start with design is identifying site characteristics, context analysis, and the conceptual stage of design. So the slide here shows how it's very important to identify a site and to actually zoom out to understand how the site fits in with its regional context and local context, and it's all down to connectivity. So the slide that shows here shows a site that's in the middle of the page, as you'll see, with isobars for travel distances at sort of 400, 800 and 1,000 metres. And what's captured within that is various land uses. It could be connections, public rights of way, how cyclists and pedestrians are linked, and just how generally the site relates to its context. In this example, it was on the eastern outskirts of a village in Somerset called Wiveliscombe, which had very much a large conservation area, which is shown in purple, as you can see. Various land uses around it as well, but the site was quite well connected to then a wider footway and cycle network, which is shown in the orange dashed lines. So again, it's just understanding all of the connections for that site and what the access to perhaps local services as well, bus routes, etc., etc. All important for understanding the wider site context. We then kind of zoom in really to the site itself, and this is a site that we undertook in Somerset again, which is where we do a lot of our work at the moment. Now this is a small site, just under a hectare, and this is where we looked at constraints really. So it's understanding and considering development considerations. So, for example, this site here was on the western outskirts of a village called Wedmore, and very much this site would then recreate the gateway to Wedmore as approached from the west. So it's quite an important piece of analysis work to do on this site and to understand the constraints and exactly how that would appear as you entered that village from the west. So there was lots of constraints on this one. There was kind of arboricultural constraints, root protection zones. The site had a fairly gentle slope on it, so considering topography, always very important. Land uses around, so to understand that there's a local school opposite to the north. There was quite a large amount of listed buildings to the east. And we identified building heights as well in association with understanding those listings, so you can assess how your new development could potentially impact or not, or how it should be shaped really in relation to setting and heritage in that respect. There was lots of services that entered the site. So again, small schemes, although can be quite constrained, and if they are, quite often makes for great opportunities to do something that, using those constraints in a positive way to shape your scheme. So that was a very kind of small site that we're kind of presenting there. This site, just put another example there. This was a site on the southwestern outskirts of a village in North Somerset. Now this was quite a unique one. This is Countryside Edge. It wasn't in the green belt at all, but it was very much on the outskirts and very, very close to the countryside. It was an identified site in the local plan, so we were over the hurdles of the planning issues that go with developing near a countryside. This is an application that's got an outline application running. Now, again, this one was quite constrained by way of public rights of way, accesses to the site. It had large amounts of drainage that were crossing the site as well, and public rights of way. It was quite sloped. It was quite a sloping, so it sloped down to the southwest. So you'll see in the southwest corner there was potential for attenuation, where drainage may have to be considered before it sort of discharges into a local watercourse, for example. We had a lot of landscape and ecological advice on this one as well. So it was recommended that landscape buffers and ecology buffers were provided to the perimeter, to the west, south and east, just to help visually enclose that where we were expanding the village boundary slightly. There was good access to a local school to the north, hopefully you can see that, and then local services and bus routes locally, and good access to play areas and wider recreation areas. So for this scheme in particular, we may not have had to provide too much in terms of public open space on site, as there were wider provision made. And the third one, really, this is kind of a larger, well, medium to large scale development, where again this was relating back to the first slide I showed you on context and connectivity. So this is the site zoomed in again. This one was heavily constrained with sort of landscape buffers on the western field. There was a very large lagoon that was storing surface water from an adjacent employment use to the southwest, accessed from an existing B road, so it was quite noisy on the northern boundary. Lots of drainage and sort of rights of way passing through the site, but again it provided for a great opportunity, and I'll come on to how the scheme developed later on. The site was on two plateaus, so the western field was about 3 metres higher than the eastern field, and I'll come on to how we developed that later in the presentation as to how we made the transition between the two sites. The envelope, the visual envelope, is quite exposed to the hills locally from the east and to the south. So again, that had to be visually contained, and the advice was given to visually contain the site in that respect. Again, going back to the site visit, very important. So you'll see on this slide, with the constraints plan, a series of photographs which identify a small amount of photographs that kind of detail those kind of boundaries and where those photographs were taken from. So you can clearly see the openness of the boundaries on the bottom photographs, and how it's visually contained to the west on the photographs at the top of the slide. The next stage after the kind of context, the local context analysis, and the identification of constraints, we then move on to character analysis locally. So what we do is we spend a lot of time walking around towns and villages in association with where the site is, to collect up what we call the ingredients. So this is the influencing and shaping credentials that you may consider before putting a design together. So I call them the ingredients, and we generally split these into 6 categories, which is urban form, scale and massing, so looking at how buildings are put together historically and in modern times, how they fit together, the periods that they generally fall within as well. It's always important to assess all manner of character and context, so it's not necessarily just historic context, it could be local and more modern context as well. So we find ourselves assessing, historic character, post-war, and modern developments as well, to help shape and build our picture of what a design may be influenced by. What links with that very closely is materials palette, and so understanding the appearance of buildings. So what is the general predominance of materials. In this, the case I've used here is the site in Liscombe, where the dominant material was reconstituted stone and natural stone historically, with then brick and render interspersed, topped with mainly slate roofs, with sort of pan tile and sort of double Roman tiles of kind of a mixture of colours, of greys to browns and reds. Parking is quite an important consideration for design, and as ever, parking standards are getting greater. Again, when you're planning schemes, especially for family homes, there has to be some realism in terms of how parking is distributed, and kind of knits in with the actual structure of the actual schemes themselves. Architectural detailing, so in association with the urban scale, massing and materials, is what detailing is. So looking at things like windows, doors, canopy styles, how eaves treatments might be treated, ridges, verges, plinths. The list is endless. So I'd say on average we generally take around sort of 200 to 250 photographs when we do our character analysis. And architectural detailing is a very important part of the wider suite of analysis of material. Boundary treatments and landscaping is again extremely important to understand context, and once injected to a scheme can really make or break a scheme. So it's the boundary treatments and landscaping that can really define and help define character of the scheme that you're designing. So again, in this particular instance, there was very much a high proportion of natural stone walls, low and high, and then hedges and timber fences. So that, again, in that particular design, formed quite a good baseline for how we treated the boundaries on that particular scheme. And the final one is public realm and open spaces. So really understanding how public open space, green space, natural open green spaces are delivered in the wider area, how they function, how they relate to walking and cycling movements, to really then help shape that scheme that you're then going to take through into the design. We then conclude the character analysis with a set of ingredients that are then refined to then take forward into your design concept and into your design development. Again, at every single stage, we would talk to the client about that, have a do's and don'ts list, which is quite often what we do get, and the hates and not so hates. And so all of that forms part of your kind of philosophy and consideration chart. We then move on to concept. So before any kind of detailed scheme is put together, we would kind of take the ingredients of the constraints, the opportunities, and the context and the connectivity, and really start then to build up a picture of how a scheme could be developed. Now, as a designer, you never really certainly I'm not satisfied with the first stab, if you like, to put it in those terms. So I would say for every scheme, I generally would produce 2 or 3 different concepts just to test different ideas. Now, when you've got a heavily constrained development site, it's quite easy to go one way, but there is more than one way to skin the cat, as it were. So hence why we investigate more than just one concept. I mean, this one here was quite well established. There's connections to the local school. There was a public right-of-way that actually moved through the site from north to south, with a very large drainage easement alongside it. So what we felt was, as there was a singular vehicular access to the northeast, we could then wind a village street into what we would call a green hub of the development, which then basically forms an area where all of the social activity is combined and then acts as the hub of all the routes of movement, particularly for pedestrians and cyclists. And we could then establish perhaps some local play opportunities in those smaller areas, with then views out to the wider context through gaps in existing hedgerows and using perhaps existing vegetation and mature trees and established, say, oak trees, for example, on this site that were and that was quite well received. The connections to the wider community were very important, so the various routes out to the north, the south, and then a very important link to the east via to the recreation area. So the site is very, very well connected. So what you'll see then is how the development blocks and shapes are formed in the middle, and how they're connected, and then a consideration for how the drainage connects at the southwest boundary, identifying again that area for potential attenuation. So once the concept is established and that's agreed with the client, we would then go on to start thinking about how we make a place and go into the detailed design. So this slide really just demonstrates just a few bullet points of what types of things we would think about in terms of our placemaking. So as you'll see on the left, provision of high quality sustainable homes and homes of longevity, as we said earlier on. So very much building for life and taking those principles and injecting those into the design. Thinking about walking and cycling, connectivity, as I mentioned earlier, the recreation and socialising, very much complementing its context. Now that doesn't mean necessarily repeating style, and we'll go on a bit later on how differences of opinion on that have changed over the years and continue to change. Very much respecting wildlife and the landscape credentials and context. Spend a bit of time with the community engagement. So there might be some aspirations by the local authority. There might be aspirations by parish councils, town councils. There might be some aspirations within local plans, neighbourhood plans, design documents that can all feed in to help making that place. And encouraging social activity. So the best schemes I found are those that feel welcoming and very much feel community led. And having seen a few schemes out over the years, you can clearly see how when they're designed correctly to function in that way, is how successful they can actually be. Along the strategic priority, there's opportunities for carbon reduction, obviously in the ever-changing sustainability techniques. The importance of green and blue infrastructure, for that matter, so water treatment, public open space and ecology, and how that's kind of knitted in and threaded in to the designs, delivering diverse ranges and mixes of houses and buildings, residential. I mean, we particularly concentrate on residential schemes, so we constantly talk to clients and developers about general mix. Infrastructure, so sort of connectivity, digital connectivity, we'll all be aware now of, and we certainly are still working at home at this point from March, and how the digital world is very important. So having high levels of broadband connectivity, for example, is everything to make it sort of sustainable and accessible. Development of communities, as I said, promotion of health and well-being within schemes, so green spaces, respecting green spaces, and establishing centres for these schemes to act as focal points and hubs of social interaction. Linkages to local services, again looking at the wider context, and then supporting priority habitats and ecology. There's a lot of influence from biodiversity net gain across schemes, and local authorities take a slightly different approach, we found. And you've also got the kind of phosphate influence as well, which we've experienced very recently. So between phosphate impact and biodiversity net gain can have quite an impact on the development of schemes, but also it could prove to be of benefit. It can be exploited for a great opportunity for green space, for example. On this slide, again, it's just expanding and illustrating really just some further principles of what makes a difference in terms of placemaking. So the creation of spaces for social interaction. So the top left-hand image shows there a development that's got a backdrop of well-connected and well-designed village street buildings. With then in the foreground, which is the hub of the development, a social interaction, which is a very, very simple walled garden, for example, with benches in there, places where toddlers could, socialise with mums and dads, and on a great day, that would be a great space to be in. Place shape, and now topography is very important. So in the middle image, you'll see there that it's actually using topography in a positive way. So it shouldn't always be seen as a massive constraint on development, subject to the detailed design, really. So here, in that particular image, we used a plateau of development at the higher level on the left, and then worked in a public open space and play area design within the sloped element of the site. So it very much gave you a very creative timber placescape on multiple levels that really did react, and that sort of gives you that interaction, and quite unique interaction as well. The creation of unique buildings is quite important for scheme design. So you'll see there just a small illustration. This was from the Wedmore scheme that I sort of went over the constraints earlier. So again, that was the creation of a gateway building that was drawing on influences from the local character, and we decided to go with more of a historic context character for that building there, which was designed as a 360-degree outward-facing building that not only acted as a gateway building to the village, the new gateway, but also sat in its own kind of green grounds, if you like. Threading in blue and green infrastructure is becoming ever more important, so sustainability and sustainable urban drainage techniques. So it doesn't necessarily have to be within just attenuation ponds or basins or underground. So there's great opportunities now to integrate sort of open channels, watercourses, different forms of percolation, and really threading that into the landscape design that then sits around the development as well. The public realm, very, very important in terms of quality. Now, public realm doesn't just mean green spaces and places to socially interact. Public realm is all about the way it just appears, really. So how the interface of buildings heights, materials, details, and landscaping all hang together. And it's very much a responsibility of the design team to discuss and kind of conclude what the best appearance and mixture of the various elements are. And finally, there, just high quality materials and boundary treatments can make or break a scheme in our view. The material and the landscaping as well. So those three things integrated can really help shape and form a place of character and quality. The next slide, so this is where we come on to the samples of development. So this was a scheme of 18 dwellings, which was on the southwestern outskirts of Wedmore. The building I described just now was in the middle. There's a gateway building here. So this was made up of a landscape gateway to the west, opposite the tennis courts, as you'll see there, with a simple priority junction design of a raised table, just again to reinforce that kind of gateway into the village, but also act as a gateway into the development. So this scheme was designed as a shared surface and very much was an inward-facing design, quite unique, which had a walled garden at the development core. So buildings, the shape of the buildings were influenced by the wider context of very much wide-fronted buildings, cottages, in fact, in this case, all linked together in a harmonious way to then enclose that central space. So really, this was the point of arrival in the development. And then there was a second field to the southeast, as you'll see, which then was developed slightly further along the same principles. So a very intimate form of development. And those were taking influence from some of the buildings around in the conservation area, so very much a barn-like appearance. with a landscape treatment that kind of surrounded the boundary. There was a building called the Blandings, as you'll see, that was very close, which was a Grade 2 listed building. So again, setting issues had to be considered with that particular building. Hence why the building shapes and the development forms are what they are in the bottom, in the south east corner. The scheme was all 2-storey, again respecting the very local context to the east. With then a 1.5-storey gateway building as a feature building, just to provide some sort of standout building on the gateway into the development. And you'll see a street scene at the bottom of the slide there, which shows how the street appearance was. So it was very much a dual aspecting scheme. So we put as much effort into the design of the rear of the buildings, which sometimes quite often can be downplayed. But I think in this instance, it was very important to have a presence, albeit with a landscape backdrop or foredrop to the main street, which worked out quite successful. And that development is under construction right now. It's looking quite good. The next scheme was around 60 dwellings. So this really builds up on the concept plan that I presented earlier. So you can see how the streets and spaces were shaped. Through the central part of the development, you can see how that's a complete shared surface. So you wouldn't know really there's a very large drain run going through there. So it's very much trying to disguise those constraints, but in a creative way. So this is served by a singular village street with a backdrop of buildings of semi-detached and detached, for example, in this case. A small play area in the middle of the site, just at the head of that central shared surface street, which would be for mainly toddler play. And then we positioned play features to the north of that one and towards a southern boundary. So when you traverse the public right of way, you then get although there's a small hub for toddler play, there was also a scheme of play on the way features, which is great for social interaction. So as you move through the development, naturally there are things to do on the way for children and young teens, for example. You can clearly see how we've connected to the wider site, to the community and recreation area along the east, and to the public right of way to the south. The blue arrow on the southern boundary was actually a retained track from the adjacent landowner, which had a right of access to the site. So again, you can see how that has naturally been kind of integrated into the development. And although the scheme is quite small itself, what it does provide is a circulatory route for pedestrians. So because a scheme is quite small doesn't mean that you can't prioritise that pedestrian movement. So, people could enter the site from the north, from the northeast, and actually traverse around the development in a circulatory way, a pleasant walk in a village street character. This scheme is mainly 2-storey, again, relating well to the local context, and as advised by the landscape consultant, if you like. We did discuss having some building height in the middle, so where the streets were slightly wider in the middle in the shared surface, and an element of 2.5-storey, which is essentially a 3-storey building, was inserted just to enclose that wider space. And parking is very well integrated, as you can see. The scheme presented here is the site in Woodliscombe, which I mentioned earlier in the context and connectivity. So this scheme was slightly larger at 93 dwellings. Again, very, very constrained. This was a site that had 2 plateaus. So the left-hand field was about 3.5 metres higher than the eastern field. And hopefully you can see that there's an existing track that runs down through the middle of the development. Now, that was a track that was a right of way for the local water authority to access their existing pumping station to the south of the site. So it was a very much a constraint to the development, but again, we've turned that on its head and actually built that into the scheme. So this was designed really to be to have a central hub, a central core, where most of the play opportunities were and social interaction would take place, then all routes of movement connecting to it. So at the middle of the site, the play area was merged into the topography, as I said earlier, with play opportunities, timber playscape opportunities. Now, what the central hub was surrounded by was a set of, in this case, detached buildings. So when we looked at the context and connectivity of this particular site, the grain of basically the outlying kind of areas of the village were very much of a detached nature. So we took very much a garden town approach to the middle of that scheme by setting the buildings back, giving them good front gardens, high quality landscaped frontages, and as you'll see at the street scene at the bottom illustrates how those buildings appear. So detached buildings with hip roofs, stone frontages, and elements of traditional sort of detailing. To the west and the east, we created then a series of new streets, if you like. So when we minimised, in this case, the creation of parking courts. The trends for parking courts have changed over the years. You know, back in the 90s, late 90s and early 2000s, parking courts and density were everything, which did lead to some criticisms of schemes. And when we do go back and look at schemes of that age, there are clearly some kind of negative impacts on quality environments of places. So I think we've very much done a bit of a U-turn in more recent times over the parking provision and the distribution to make it more livable and more workable. So the shared surface new streets again are bounded by semi-detached and detached buildings and small amounts of terracing. The scheme was all two-storey in its form, as advised by landscape consultants when they did their landscape and visual appraisal. So that was embraced and embedded, and this one was successfully negotiated with the local authority within I think it's about 4.5 or 5 months. So, and this we took a very much a collaborative approach with the local authority, and we would highly encourage that as part of the not just consultant team but the wider team. So working with key stakeholders like local authorities and consultees accordingly. In terms of appearance, now when you assess a scheme, there's very much, again, it's about personal opinion. So it's the whole challenge of what are your influences. So from your context analysis, do you feel that a traditional or historic approach is more appropriate for your scheme? Or would a modern contemporary scheme, taking the ingredients of your character analysis but delivered in much more of a modern way, be as successful? It's very much a 50-50 discussion, depending on what parts of the country and what local authorities we generally work with, and also down to the client brief as to what their aspirations for the scheme are. When house builders and developers sell to customers, I think the more traditional historic appearance is more familiar. So I think there's some general opinion, and that should form the basis of the development. In more urban places, town centres, the kind of contemporary approach may be more appropriate and more in keeping. But it's very much down to negotiation and getting the best kind of solution for everyone. So thank you for listening to my presentation today, and I'll just hand you back to Dawn for the next part of the webinar. Thank you very much.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Darren, for your presentation and explaining the design evolution process and how these affected a number of sites. We're doing quite well for time. We've got about 15 minutes. So I'm just going to move on to the Q&As now. So if you have got a question, please feel free to raise them in the questions box. I've got a number lined up already, Darren, so if you're happy to take them.
Yeah,
so
sure.
do you think there's any quick wins in terms of design improvements or key design elements which local authorities could adopt universally to improve development?
Yeah, I mean, I never look for the easy answer and the quick wins. So I'd always say that it's just a collaborative approach. I think I just always encourage interaction with designers as much as possible. I think most designers, like myself, we encourage and we relish the opportunity to actually work with people, to actually come up with these schemes in a positive way. So I think that's what I would say there.
Thank you. Do you consider that the delivery of on-site biodiversity net gain is realistic and deliverable, or is this more likely to be delivered off-site?
It's a very interesting question. I have had it's a timely question, in fact, because I've had a very recent experience where biodiversity net gain on-site, the calculation that was provided by the ecological consultant virtually made the site undevelopable. Now, the particular instance I've come across most recently is that the local authority that we are actually dealing with doesn't have a policy for off-site contributions. So technically, we're stuck. So I think the only way to unlock those types of things is to find pieces of land that are available and can be negotiated for offset biodiversity net gain. It's becoming harder and harder, and ultimately the landowners are the ones that will have to, change their expectations, shall we say, on sites going forward and their developments.
Like particularly given the promise that 30% is going to be safeguarded for biodiversity net gain going forward.
Absolutely.
Another question, good placemaking includes elements such as unique building forms, high quality materials and public realm. In some more rural areas, viability is a key consideration to such extent the development plan allocations are not viable to provide policy compliant social or physical infrastructure. Have you got any suggestions in securing quality public realm design where provision of unique building forms, high quality materials and high quality public realm are pushing up the viability of the scheme?
Sorry, can you just repeat that last little bit? Sorry, Dawn.
Sorry. I think in summary, it's how can you secure sort of high quality design and public realm on sites in rural areas that are pushed on viability grounds?
I think, again, I go back to my point earlier on that sometimes simplicity can actually pay off in schemes. So it doesn't necessarily have to be, full of, elements of detailing, materials and that are very, very expensive. So, there are modest, in our experience and working with developers as we do, there are modest ways to deliver high quality and sustainability and public realm appearance without actually costing an absolute fortune. I think it's a technique in design that is it's a fine balance, but I think by negotiating and coming up with a collaborative approach can be successful, and we've proved that in some of our schemes that we've done, particularly rural areas as well. Rural areas naturally, things like boundary treatments, for example, more rural areas are more softly dominated, so you wouldn't necessarily be into lots and lots of walls and railings and things like that. So it could be done very much with soft treatments, 100% soft treatments if we needed to. We've had experiences with developers where, for example, screen walls that are always asked for in public realm appearance in the streets, they can be substituted with ready hedges, for example, which are quite often less in terms of cost, but can give you that kind of green and rural appearance. So there's various techniques and approaches you can take, I would say.
Thank you. Do you consider aspects of designing for health in schemes? If yes, what issue would you consider?
For health, when you look at building design, and again, there's lots of policies over adaptable buildings, allowing for people with disabilities, for example. So, there are lots of policies in local authorities that do drive the accounting for those types of consistencies, I suppose, in building design. So some local authorities might ask you for accessible homes, lifetime home compliancy, national space standards, We design a lot for wheelchair users, so M43 compliancy across various different forms, so flats, houses, bungalows even, for example, So again, it's not a great trend these days, or it hasn't been in the last few years for bungalow development, but various developers are coming round to the fact that actually by delivering bungalows, for example, does cater for a slightly wider context in terms of purchaser, and can help with those kind of health and well-being issues, and don't detract too much from value, if you like.
How important is design review?
Design review. I mean, we work with a lot of local authorities, and we've undertaken design review with various panels in and around the country. Personally, I find them very useful. Again, it's part of that wider team collaboration. Again, when you have a scheme reviewed, it's easy to take things personally, but it's not a personal attack on what you're doing. So I very much take those responses and those presentations and organisations as very helpful in the overall process. And I think they're not always appropriate for every single scheme, but we certainly do recognise the importance of it for the right types of scheme to be, and I think it's also making sure that they're done at the right time as well, which I think is the earlier evolution of any scheme.
Thank you. And how do the issues of security of homes figure into your considerations?
Security, yeah, very much so. Again, with schemes, you'll always get sort of consultee responses from architectural liaison officers and secure by design officers. So what we try and do in schemes generally is to not design places that are, dark alleyways, for example, places that people can loiter, to threaten security and, sort of well-being, if you like. So people need to feel safe. So very much, public realm facing buildings, making sure that all spaces are supervised properly. And that can be, side windows in buildings. That could even be lower boundary walls in rear gardens, for example, where it's not always possible to supervise a particular space. Lockable gates, simplistically on rear gardens, for example, making sure your storage is lockable. And all of those are the ingredients that feed into all of our schemes and developers embrace as part of a good secure by design principles across our schemes.
Thank you. And I think this will probably be the last question for now. So do you think the proposed use of design codes will stifle innovation and local design solutions?
If design codes are good, if they are sort of developed in a cohesive way, if you like. I mean, we also produce design codes for schemes, for outline schemes in particular. And I think they are, and I don't think they stifle necessarily, but I think what they have got to have is the right ingredients and the right conclusions. And in the developer world is the commercial awareness as well of what those design codes actually deliver or are seeking to deliver, because there seem to be some disparity from my experience in design codes that are designed with not the commercial world in mind. So I think, again, it's all about negotiating and liaising with local authorities on what the aspiration of what those design codes are there to do and aim to deliver. I think a well-designed scheme with the right level of control in an outline application, in a comprehensive design and access statement, for example, can do as well as design codes to quite a large proportion. And I think design codes, if you take, for example, like a duchy scheme like Townbury, for example, I know that there's a town code, Sherford in just outside of Plymouth, there's a town code for that. We've designed for that particular scheme, and yeah, there were some good ingredients in there.
I think the trick for them is not to be too prescriptive, because if it's too prescriptive, it's just like cookie cutter over and over.
Yeah, it is. And again, I think people can kind of get carried away with too much detail. And again, as I said earlier on, keeping it relatively simple quite often gives you the better designed appearance in schemes, for sure.
Lovely. Thank you so much for your time today, Darren. I'd like to thank everyone who took the time to log in today. Next week, a copy of this video and a presentation and the further responses to the questions that we didn't get around to answering will be emailed to all participants. There's also a feedback survey that will be sent to you immediately after this session. If you could take the time to fill it in, because we do take any feedback into consideration. Please also keep an eye on the RTPI website for any more virtual opportunities. And thank you again, Darren, for your time today. And thank you everyone for tuning in. Be brave, be bold, and be brilliant. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.